Now we must zoom out for a moment and ask, what is a state as such, or more precisely, in what does its essence consist? In the previous video, I discussed how state differs from the earlier forms of community according to Aristotle. It is the most self-sufficient and exists not merely for the preservation of the human race, but for providing its citizens with the good life, life according to excellence. However, we know that there are different varieties of states, namely democratic, monarchic, aristocratic, etc. Then the question arises, how do these states differ from one another? Or to reformulate our question, what is the prime cause determining the nature of a state, namely its difference from other states? It is constitution, says Aristotle, the arrangement of offices and magistracies in a state, especially of the highest of all, the arrangement that determines which citizens will share in the government of a state. In short, the constitution is responsible for the distribution of power. Thus, it represents the skeleton or the structure of the state. But to put it in Aristotelian terms, if the constitution is the formal cause of the state, then what is its material cause? That which must be formed into a state, like a marble into a statue. The citizens, answers Aristotle yet again. It is the inhabitants of a state, namely their arrangement, that is shaped by the constitution. The constitution determines who shall hold the power and according to what principle. Which citizens will make up the governing body, so to speak. For example, if the governing body of a state is made up of the poor, the state, and thus its constitution, will be democratic. If the reverse is true, and the rich few are supreme, the state and its constitution will be oligarchic. And so in other cases, since the citizens are the elementary particles, atoms in its original sense, from which the state is made. But again, another question arises. What makes a citizen, or who is to be considered as one? Now, some believe that a citizen is merely one who lives inside the walls or borders of a state, which is of course very vulgar and shallow notion of citizenship. But first and foremost, it is inaccurate, as Aristotle puts it, since slaves and foreigners too reside in a state, even though neither of them is a citizen. There is also another definition of citizenship, namely that citizen is one who has the legal rights of suing and being sued. Although relatively more concise, this definition too falls short of the truth, since again, slaves and foreigners may too have such rights, even though they themselves are not citizens. And last but not least, there has been a popular notion of citizenship among ancient peoples based on ancestry and blood lineage. Namely, only he can be considered a citizen whose parents or at least one of them has been citizen of a given state. But although quite prevailing among Greek states, this definition is quite problematic, which becomes very evident in Aristotle's implication. In practice, a citizen is defined to be one of whom both the parents are citizens. Others insist on going further back, say to two or three or more ancestors. This is a short and practical definition, but there are some who raise the further question how this third or fourth ancestor came to be a citizen. In other words, if citizenship can be traced back to one's ancestors, then what about the ancestors themselves? How did they gain their citizenship? According to what principle? Certainly not based on their ancestry. Since all these answers have failed to give us a comprehensive definition of citizenship, we go back to the aforementioned question what makes a citizen? Thus, Aristotle offers us his definition. A citizen is one who sits on juries and in the assembly, i.e., shares in the administration of justice and in offices. He who has the power to take part in the deliberative or judicial administration of any state. In short, only he who partakes in government is a citizen. However, if there exists a notion of citizenship, there must also exist a notion of a good and bad citizen. In other words, a citizen who fulfills his civic duty and a citizen who does not. Now, here things get a little complicated. For according to Aristotle, the virtue of a citizen is relative to the constitution of which he is a member. Therefore, there may be as many definitions of a good citizen as many forms of the Constitution exist. Since, like the sailor, the citizen is a member of a community. Now, although sailors have different functions and thus their exclusive definitions of virtue, there is still a common definition applicable to them all, for all of them have a common object, which is safety in navigation. Similarly, one citizen differs from another, but the salvation of the community is the common business of them all, and this community is the Constitution. In other words, a good citizen is one who serves the salvation of one's state, who lives and dies for his state to prosper and flourish. Therefore, the virtue of a citizen who lives under a monarchy and the one who lives under a democracy substantially differ from one another, because each serves a fundamentally different constitution. This is the reason why a good or excellent man and a good citizen do not necessarily coincide with each other. Since, as Aristotle puts it, excellence or virtue of the man is always and everywhere the same, whereas the virtue of a citizen depends entirely on the regime and thus is relative. This is also evident in the fact that a state cannot be composed of good men, yet each citizen is expected to fulfill his civic duty, i.e., prove himself a good citizen. However, according to Aristotle, it is still possible in some cases for the good man to be identical to the good citizen, namely in the case of the best regime. For only in the best regime is the good of the regime and the good of the good man identical, that goal being a virtue. This amounts to saying that in his Politics, Aristotle questions the proposition that patriotism is enough. From the point of view of the patriot, the fatherland is more important than any difference of regimes. But from the point of view of classical metaphysics, the fatherland or the nation is the matter, whereas the regime is the form. The classics held the view that the form is higher in dignity than the matter. The practical meaning of this idealism is that the good is of higher dignity than one's own, or that the best regime is a higher consideration than the fatherland. It is precisely because of this supremacy of the regime over the fatherland that Aristotle attributes the identity of a state to its constitution. According to him, According to him, if the form of the government is altered, then the state can no longer be considered the same. This is because not the elements but the composition of their union determine the essence of a thing. The same goes for the state. It is not its citizens, but the constitution that determines its identity, whether it is a monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy. In short, to reiterate Aristotle's words, the sameness of the state consists chiefly in the sameness of the constitution. Now, going back to discussing the special case in which the meaning of a good man and a good citizen coincide, I have already mentioned above that the best state may be considered such a case, but I have not yet elucidated what kind of state it is that Aristotle considers the best. While its constitution, its form of government is key to understanding how it makes possible this intersection of civic and human virtue. The fact is that when talking about civic virtue, one must keep in mind that there are two basic forms of civic duties, one of ruling and other of subjection. And hence, according to Aristotle, there are two subcategories of civic virtue, one of the rulers and the other of the subjects, which are fundamentally different from each other, since while both ruler and subject share almost all other values, the practical wisdom belongs only to the ruler. The subject can merely have the true opinion, but not the wisdom itself. Therefore, while the civic virtue of the subject does not coincide with the virtue of a good man, this is not true for the civic virtue of the ruler. The good ruler, says Aristotle, is a good and wise man, for he who would be a statesman must be a wise man. In short, the virtue of a good ruler is the same as that of a good man. In most states of Aristotle's time, Rulers were necessarily chosen from the higher class, either aristocratic or oligarchic, while the lower classes almost had no share in the government. Therefore, the higher and lower classes were educated differently. While one was being prepared to rule well over one's subjects, the other was prepared to become obedient servant, skilled merely in menial tasks, art, so to speak. Hence, practical wisdom was an essential part of the education of rulers, while totally disregarded by the education of subjects. For unlike the subject, the ruler is responsible both for himself and his subject. Thus, he must be aware of the causes and effects of his decision as a ruler, and most importantly, of their ends, which concludes with only a small minority of good citizens also being good and wise men, while almost the absolute majority of citizens consisting of the lower class are merely good citizens. However, there is a form of government called the constitutional government or polity by Aristotle, under which such distinction does not prevail. While under the monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, or other forms of government, only a small minority are capable of ruling, under the constitutional rule, the good citizen ought to be capable of both ruling and obeying. He should know how to govern like a freeman and how to obey like a freeman. These are the virtues of a citizen. Thus, the virtue of the good citizen and the virtue of the good man may be same under the constitutional rule, a rule which is exercised over free men and equals by birth, a rule which the ruler must learn by obeying. In other words, since under the constitutional government each citizen is both ruler and subject, he must be educated in both the ruling and obeying. Or to put it in Aristotle's words, each citizen must learn ruling first by obeying, just like in the military. Thus, by becoming a good citizen, one also becomes a good and wise man. This is one of the reasons why Aristotle considers constitutional rule the best possible form of government. It is a mean between democracy and oligarchy, hence it is ruled not by the rich who are too disobedient and arrogant, or the poor who on the contrary are too obedient and slavish, but by the middle class who are moderate and wise. Here it must be noted that the aforementioned similarity between the citizen of the polity and the military man is not a mere coincidence. According to Aristotle, the constitutional government was originally born out of the infantry. More concisely, when the heavy armed grew in power compared to the cavalry, which was the main force in aristocratic Greece. It is also important to note that the definition of the citizen offered by Aristotle is only valid under the constitutional government. I'm talking about the definition according to which the citizen is one who partakes in government, more concisely in the administration of justice and in offices. Because it is only under the constitutional rule that each citizen is both ruler and subject. As for the other forms of government, I will discuss them in the next video, so stay tuned.